Welcome to the History Stories podcast. Today, we're embarking on a historic road trip to explore a truly legendary place, the ancient Library of Alexandria.
It really is legendary, isn't it? Such an evocative name.
Absolutely. And, most people think of this single dramatic fire that just wiped it out.
That's the popular image, definitely. A huge blaze.
But your history books and uncovered sources, they reveal something much more complex, more intriguing, actually, about what really happened to this incredible lighthouse of the mind.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, the sources paint a picture that's less Hollywood blockbuster and more, well, a long, slow historical process.
So our mission on this historic road trip is really to sift through all that, the truth, the myths, the mysteries. It's kind of a centuries-long historical puzzle we're trying to unpack.
Exactly. Forget one big fire. Think. Slow decline, multiple suspects, maybe some bad luck thrown in. It's a much richer story, I think.
Okay, let's start with that myth then. The single fire idea. It's so powerful, right? This image of all that ancient knowledge just going up in smoke.
It is powerful. You see it referenced everywhere, like you said. Carl Sagan famously talked about it. Movies depict it.
But the history books and uncovered sources you shared, they really push back against that simple narrative.
They do. It's much less neat than a single catastrophe. The sources point towards, well, a whole sequence of events, and maybe more importantly, long-term factors.
So instead of one villain, we've got a lineup of suspects.
Pretty much. It makes for a more compelling investigation, doesn't it? The simple story is appealing, sure, but the messy reality, digging into the accounts, that's where the real history is.
Right. So let's meet suspect number one, Julius Caesar. 48 BCE. Big name.
Huge name. And he was definitely in Alexandria, involved in the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother.
And there was a fire, right? Something about ships burning in the harbor. Could that have spread?
There absolutely was a fire in the harbor. Caesar himself talks about burning enemy ships. It was a military tactic.
Okay, so fire, Caesar, Alexandria. It seems plausible.
And some later writers do connect this to the library. Seneca, quoting Livy, who's now lost, mentions 40,000 scrolls burned.
40,000, that sounds devastating.
It does. And Plutarch even goes so far as to say the fire destroyed the great library. Dio Cassius talks about warehouses full of scrolls burning.
Okay, so maybe it was Caesar, an accidental arsonist. Case closed.
Well, not so fast. Here's the thing. Caesar himself, in his own detailed account of the Alexandrian War, he says nothing about it.
Nothing about burning down the most famous library in the world. That seems odd.
It's a pretty major omission, isn't it? And then you have Strabo, the geographer. He visits Alexandria maybe, 25 years later? Around 20 BCE.
Okay. And what does Strabo say?
He gives this detailed description of the Maution, the research institute attached to the library. He talks about the buildings, the scholars.
But does he mention, oh, and by the way, the great library next door burned down a couple of decades ago?
He doesn't, not in that description, which is really strange if it had been completely destroyed.
So what does that mean? Maybe it wasn't destroyed? Or maybe it was damaged but repaired?
That's the puzzle. Strabo does complain elsewhere about losing access to certain old source materials scholars used to have, so maybe the collection took a hit.
So maybe the buildings were fine, mostly, but some scrolls were lost. Possibly those warehouse scrolls Dio Cassius mentioned.
That's what many scholars lean towards now. The fire probably damaged those dockside warehouses. Maybe they held scrolls confiscated from ships, waiting to be processed. But the main royal library, which was in the palace quarter, the Bruchion,
that likely survived. Maybe damaged, but not obliterated.
Exactly. It seems Caesar became a convenient scapegoat later on. The evidence from the time just isn't strong enough to pin the main library's destruction on him.
Okay, so Caesar's fire was probably a blow, but maybe not the fatal one for the main institution. He gets put on the back burner for now. Let's move forward a few centuries. Suspect number 2, Emperor Aurelian.
Right, now we're in the late 3rd century CE, around 270-275. Different situation. Alexandria was briefly under the control of the Palmyrene Empire, led by Queen Zenobia.
And Aurelian comes in to take it back for Rome. Sounds like a recipe for conflict.
A very violent one, actually. The sources describe really heavy fighting, particularly in that same royal district, the Bruchion.
Where the palaces were?
Mm-hmm.
And the Maution. And presumably whatever was left of the main library.
Precisely. And the accounts talk about serious devastation in that area. Some sources even call the Bruchion a desert afterwards.
A desert. That sounds Pretty final for any buildings there.
It really does. And there's other circumstantial evidence, too. We know that membership in the Maution, the scholarly body, seems to kind of fizzle out around the 260s AD, even before Aurelian got there.
So the institution might have already been struggling.
Possibly. So you put that together, the pre-existing decline, Aurelian's reconquest, the descriptions of the Brutian being ravaged.
The scholarly thinking is that this might have been the event that really damaged or destroyed the original Great Library in Mauson complex.
That's a strong possibility, yes. It looks like a much more significant blow than Caesar's fire, a major event in that slow, gradual decline we talked about.
Okay, so Aurelian is a much stronger suspect for causing serious, possibly fatal damage to the original library in the Brutian. Now, let's shift again. Suspect number 3. Bishop Theophilus and the Serapeum riot in 391 CE. This one gets talked about a lot.
It really does, and it's often presented as the moment the library was destroyed by, intolerant Christians.
Right, so the context is the late Roman Empire, Christianity is on the rise, and Emperor Theodosius has issued decrees against pagan practices.
Exactly, and Bishop Theophilus in Alexandria was, shall we say, quite zealous in enforcing these. There were tensions, provocations, Christians took over a pagan site, found some artifacts pagans found offensive.
And the pagans reacted.
They did. They retaliated and then fortified themselves inside the Serapeum complex. This was a massive, magnificent temple to the god Serapis.
And crucially, the Serapeum also housed a library, right? Sometimes called the daughter library.
That's the key point. It seems there was a significant library collection housed within the Serapeum complex, separate from the original Great Library in the Brutian.
So when Theophilus and his followers eventually stormed the Serapeum, did they burn this daughter library? And is this the event people confuse with the end of the Great Library?
This is where it gets tricky, and we have to look closely at the contemporary sources people writing at or near the time.
Okay, what do they say?
Writers like Sozomen, Rufinus, Eunapius, they focus overwhelmingly on the destruction of the temple, the smashing of the pagan idols, the religious conflict.
Not so much on a library.
Mentions of a library are actually quite limited. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing a bit earlier, even implies the Serapeum's library wasn't that significant anymore. Afgonius mentions bookstores or rooms associated with books. Only Orosius, writing later, clearly talks about book chests being emptied.
So the eyewitnesses, or near contemporaries, saw it primarily as a religious clash, the destruction of a major pagan temple, not necessarily the destruction of a great library.
That seems to be the emphasis in their accounts. The library part seems secondary, if mentioned at all in detail.
But then later writers, especially during the Enlightenment, like Edward Gibbon, they really seized on this narrative, didn't they?
Absolutely. Gibbon, famously critical of religious power, portrayed the Serapeum riot as the definitive end of Alexandrian learning, destroyed by Christian fanaticism. He kind of conflated the Serapeum's library with the original Great Library.
Ah, okay. So he used it as a powerful symbol in his arguments.
Precisely. It became a potent story about faith versus reason. So the scholarly consensus now, the Serapeum Temple was destroyed, and any library collection it still held likely went with it or was dispersed.
But this wasn't the end of the original Great Library.
Almost certainly not. The original Great Library in the Brutian was likely long gone or severely diminished by this point, probably thanks to Aurelian or just general decay. The Serapeum event was significant, but it's been historically misinterpreted and amplified.
Another layer of myth peeled back. Okay, final suspect.
Yeah.
This one is maybe the most famous story of all. Caliph Umar and the Arab conquest in 642 CE. The bathhouse story.
Ah, yes, the bathhouse story. It's incredibly persistent.
So the tale goes, the Muslim general, Amr ibn al-As, conquers Alexandria. He asks the Caliph Umar what to do about the library.
And Umar supposedly gives this very famous reply. If the books agree with the Quran, they're redundant. If they disagree, they're blasphemous. So, destroy them all.
And the punchline. The scrolls were distributed to Alexandria's 4,000 bathhouses and used as fuel.
Keeping them heated for 6 whole months. It's an amazing image.
It is. But the history books and uncovered sources you shared, they pour some serious cold water on this hot bath story, don't they?
A whole Nile's worth of cold water, you might say. The biggest problem is the timing.
When does the story first appear?
Not for over 500 years after the conquest. 5 centuries. The first mentions are in writers like Abdal-Latif and Bar-Hebraeus, writing in the 12th and 13th centuries.
Wow. So nothing from the time. No contemporary Christian, Byzantine, or even early Muslim sources mention this dramatic book burning.
Complete silence. Which is incredible if it actually happened. You'd think someone would have mentioned the destruction of the world's most famous library collection.
That's a pretty big red flag. Are there other issues with the story?
Yeah, a few. For one, papyrus actually makes pretty poor fuel. It burns vast and smoky. And by the 7th century, many valuable books were on parchment or vellum, which is animal skin, much harder to burn efficiently.
Okay, so practical problems too.
And interestingly, there's a nearly identical story told about Caliph Umar ordering the destruction of Zoroastrian books after the conquest of Persia.
Seriously, the same story structure.
Very similar. Which makes it look much more like a piece of folklore, maybe a recurring motif used to criticize or explain cultural loss, rather than a specific historical event tied to Alexandria.
So the scholarly consensus is pretty clear on this one.
Overwhelmingly clear. The bathhouse story is fiction, pure myth. By 642 CE, the Great Library as a functioning institution was almost certainly long, long gone. The story likely reflects later political or cultural tensions, not 7th century reality.
Right, so we've debunked the single fire, gone through the main suspects, Caesar, Aurelian, Theophilus, Umar, and found that none of them quite fit the bill as the sole destroyer in one dramatic event.
Exactly. The picture emerging from the sources is much more gradual.
So who or what were the real culprits? You mentioned a slow bleed, neglect, bad luck.
That seems to be the historical consensus now. It wasn't one fatal stab. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, spread over centuries.
Okay, let's break that down. First, funding. That seems critical.
Absolutely. The early Ptolemies poured vast resources into the library in Malsen. It was a prestige project.
But under Roman rule, that changed.
It seems the imperial priorities shifted. Patronage wasn't as consistent or lavish, maintaining that massive collection, recopying scrolls constantly, supporting dozens, maybe hundreds of scholars. It was incredibly expensive.
So budget cuts, essentially, over a long period.
Kind of, yeah, and maybe less direct imperial interest. We also see hints that appointments to the Mausen became more political under the Romans, which might have diluted its intellectual rigor and prestige over time.
Then there's political turmoil. Alexandria itself wasn't exactly a peaceful city through all those centuries.
Far from it. It saw dynastic struggles under the later Ptolemies, Caesar's intervention, Roman civil wars playing out there, Aurelian's reconquest, frequent riots between different ethnic and religious groups.
That constant instability must have taken a toll.
Definitely. It creates an environment where long-term preservation and scholarship are difficult. Buildings get damaged, scrolls get lost or destroyed in localized conflicts, scholars might flee. It disrupts the continuity.
And the materials themselves.
Yeah.
Papyrus isn't exactly permanent.
Especially not in a damp coastal climate like Alexandria's. Papyrus is fragile. It decays, gets eaten by insects. It required constant, dedicated, expensive care, and, crucially, recopying.
So if funding dries up or instability prevents that constant maintenance, the scrolls just naturally disintegrate over time.
That's a huge factor. Just simple material decay, neglect born from circumstance, a slow, quiet disappearance.
There are finally cultural shifts, intellectual fashions changing.
Yes. As the Hellenistic period gave way to the Roman Empire, and then as Christianity became dominant, intellectual interests changed. Texts considered less relevant or later pagan were less likely to be recopied.
So they just weren't preserved, lost through inaction rather than destruction.
A lot of it, yes. The active suppression of pagan institutions like the Serapeum was part of it in the later period, but even before that, choices were constantly being made about which texts were valuable enough to invest resources in preserving.
So it's this complex mix: fading funding, political chaos, material decay, and shifting cultural priorities. Much less dramatic than a single fire, but probably closer to the truth.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests, a long, slow fade rather than a sudden blackout.
So why do the dramatic myths persist so strongly? Why the allure of the single catastrophe?
Well, it's just a better story, isn't it? Simpler, more memorable, a clear villain, a definitive moment of loss. It fits our narrative expectations better than it gradually fell apart over 500 years due to complex socioeconomic factors.
Doesn't quite have the same ring to it.
Not really. And figures like Gibbon, as we mentioned, were hugely influential. His portrayal of the Serapeum riot really cemented that particular narrative, tying it to his broader arguments about religion and decline.
And the Umar bathhouse myth. Its late appearance and lack of evidence don't seem to stop it?
No, it taps into that powerful image of conquerors destroying culture, and perhaps, as we speculated, it served some purpose in the later historical context where it arose. It's a story that's hard to completely erase once it takes root.
It really shows how history gets written and rewritten. Okay, let's pivot slightly. We've talked a lot about how the library disappeared. Let's talk about what it was. It wasn't just a big building with scrolls, was it?
Oh, far from it. It was the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world. A symbol of Ptolemaic power and ambition, yes, but also this incredible, unprecedented experiment in gathering and organizing knowledge.
Driven by Ptolemy here, and especially Ptolemy II, right? They wanted Alexandria to be the cultural capital.
Absolutely. They used Egypt's wealth, its papyrus monopoly, to lure the best scholars from across the Greek world to Alexandria. They set up the Motion, the Shrine of the Muses.
Which was less a museum and more like
Yeah.
a think tank, a research university.
Exactly. A state-funded research institute. Scholars got salaries, tax breaks, free room and board. They were paid to think, research, write, debate.
And the library was central to that.
It was the essential tool. The goal was unbelievably ambitious: to collect copies of all the books in the world.
All of them. How did they even try to do that?
Aggressively. They sent agents out to buy scrolls. They famously required ships docking in Alexandria to surrender any books on board they'd be copied, and the copies returned while the originals went into the library.
Wow, compulsory acquisition.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they didn't just stick to Greek texts. They commissioned translations, Egyptian histories, Persian texts, famously the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint.
What about the size? How many schools are we talking about? The numbers seem all over the place.
They really are. Ancient sources give figures from 40,000 or 50,000 up to maybe 400,000 or even 700,000. Modern scholars are usually a bit more conservative, maybe leaning towards the lower end of the higher estimates, but
But still, undoubtedly the biggest collection anywhere at the time.
by far, it was seen, as one inscription apparently said, as the place of the cure of the soul, knowledge as healing.
And managing all that. That required innovation too, organizing that chaos.
Huge innovation. We hear about Zenodotus, an early librarian, possibly using alphabetical order, but the real giant here is Callimachus.
Callimachus and his Pentateuchus, what exactly was that?
The Pentateuchus, or tables, it was basically a massive catalog, maybe 120 volumes or scrolls itself, but it was so much more than a list.
How so?
It was a critical subject-based bibliography. Callimachus organized works by genre: poetry, philosophy, history, medicine, etc., then listed authors alphabetically within each genre.
Okay, that's pretty systematic.
But he also included biographical details about the author, a list of their known works, the first line of each work, roughly how long it was, and even notes on whether a text was considered authentic.
That's metadata, like ancient metadata.
It basically is. It was the first comprehensive library catalog and subject bibliography in the Western tradition, revolutionary for scholarship. It allowed people to actually navigate the sea of scrolls.
And this whole setup, the motion, the library, the resources, it attracted incredible minds, didn't it?
Absolutely stellar figures. Euclid, basically inventing geometry as we know it. Archimedes, the genius engineer and mathematician, spent time there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with amazing accuracy while he was head librarian.
Hipparchus, pioneering trigonometry and star mapping. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote his epic poem there. Editors standardizing the texts of Homer.
The list goes on and on. For centuries, it was the undisputed center of gravity for science, literature, mathematics, medicine. A true constellation of minds.
Which makes the loss, however it happened, feel even more profound. What are the echoes of that lost knowledge? How much did we actually lose?
It's impossible to quantify precisely, but the scale is vast. Remember that statistic. Less than 1% of ancient Greek and Roman literature is thought to survive today.
Less than 1%. That's staggering.
It is. Now, the library's decline isn't the only reason for that. Lost books disappeared everywhere over time if they weren't copied. But losing the central repository, the place dedicated to preservation and study, was a massive blow. We lost countless unique works, critical editions, commentaries, layers of understanding.
Can we point to specific things we know are gone? Things mentioned by surviving writers.
Oh, yes. Hundreds of lost Greek plays. We only have a fraction of the output of the great tragedians, for example. Most of Sappho's poetry is gone. Aristotle's second book of the Poetics, supposedly on comedy, imagine having that.
Wow. What about history or science?
Histories like Berossus's Babyloniaca or Manetho's Egyptiaca, only known in fragments. Works by Archimedes on things like sphere making or polyhedra, Euclid's lost works on conic sections, Eratosthenes' original geographical treatises, Aristarchus's full explanation of his heliocentric theory.
So much foundational work in science and math just gone.
Or only known indirectly. Again, it's important not to think everything was only in Alexandria. Many major works survived because they were copied elsewhere too, but the sheer diversity is what we lost. All the minor authors, the alternative viewpoints, the detailed scholarship, the texture of the ancient intellectual world.
It's like losing not just the blockbusters, but all the independent films and documentaries too. The richness is gone.
That's a good analogy. It's the loss of that residue and introspection, as one historian put it, of a whole sophisticated culture.
Let's zoom in a bit more on some of the details. You mentioned Strabo describing the Mautian. What was life like for those scholars?
Strabo paints a picture of a kind of scholarly commune within the palace complex. They had covered walkways, the peripatos for walking and discussing, like Aristotle's school, an exedra, maybe a lecture hall or meeting place, a large communal house, the oikos, where they ate together.
Sounds almost monastic, but focused on secular learning.
In a way, they had property held in common, and the whole thing was overseen by a priest, appointed first by the Ptolemies, later by the Roman emperor. They got salaries, tax breaks, free board. Pretty good gig if you were a scholar.
A very supportive environment for intellectual work. But again, Strabo focuses on the Mautian community, not so much the library building itself in that description.
Right, which keeps that question alive about the library's exact status in his time post-Caesar.
And Callimachus's Pinnaky's that cataloging system sounds revolutionary. The detail, the organization.
It really was. Think about trying to find anything in potentially hundreds of thousands of unorganized scrolls. The Pinnaky's, with its subject classification, alphabetization, author details, first lines, it made systematic research possible on a scale never seen before. It was the infrastructure of knowledge.
What about actual archaeology? Have we found the library?
Frustratingly, no definitive ruins of the main royal library or the Mautian have ever been identified. The ancient Brutian district is partly underwater now and partly built over by modern Alexandria.
So, no "Here lies the great library" plaque.
Unfortunately not. We have found remains of the Serapeum complex, which helps understand the daughter library's context. There are some later Roman lecture halls found near the theater. Underwater archaeology in the harbor has found palace structures from the Ptolemaic era, which is the right area, but nothing definitively identified as the library.
So it remains elusive, physically. Adds to the mystique, I suppose?
It certainly does. It exists more powerfully as an idea, perhaps, than as a pile of stones.
You mentioned the Septuagint translation earlier, the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That highlights it wasn't just about Greek culture, right?
Definitely. The library, at least initially, had this universalist ambition. The story of the Septuagint being commissioned for the library, involving scholars brought from Judea, shows this desire to incorporate knowledge from other major traditions. It was a hub for cross-cultural intellectual exchange.
And then there's that more esoteric mention in some sources. Something about thaumic energy.
Ah, yes, that's a more fringe idea, popping up in less mainstream discussions, suggesting some Mautian scholars might have investigated things we might loosely term magic or esoteric physics alongside traditional science, thaumic energy and harmonics.
So maybe the first school of wizardry alongside geometry and poetry.
Haha, well, probably not quite Hogwarts on the Nile, but it's an intriguing whisper suggesting the range of inquiry might have been even broader than we usually think. Adds another layer of mystery.
It all paints a picture of an institution that was just incredibly vibrant, multifaceted, and ultimately tragically lost. But there's a modern chapter to this story, isn't there? The Bibliotheca Alexandrina.
Yes, thankfully. A truly inspiring project. The new library, inaugurated in 2002.
Built near where the ancient one is thought to have stood.
Exactly. And the architecture itself is stunningly symbolic. It's designed as a giant tilted disc like the sun rising over the Mediterranean. The angled roof lets in diffuse natural light. The outer wall is carved with characters from 120 different human scripts.
Wow. And it's not just a library in the traditional sense, is it?
No, it's much more. It has massive shelf space, of course, but also specialized libraries for maps, rare books, children, the visually impaired, plus museums, antiquities, manuscripts, science history, art galleries, a planetarium.
Research centers, too.
Yes, dedicated research centers focusing on Alexandrian studies, Egyptology, information science, strategic studies, and importantly, facilities for manuscript restoration and digitization, trying to preserve knowledge in new ways.
So its mission is really to recapture that ancient spirit.
Very much so. They talk about being the world's window on Egypt and Egypt's window on the world, a center for learning, tolerance, dialogue, cultural exchange, trying to embody the ideals, if not the actual scrolls, of its ancient predecessor. It uses digital outreach extensively, too, connecting globally.
It's a powerful symbol of resilience and the enduring value of knowledge, isn't it? Connecting the past to the future.
It really is. It acknowledges the loss, but also affirms the ongoing human drive to gather, understand, and share knowledge across cultures and time.
So wrapping up our historic road trip, it's clear the story of the Library of Alexandria isn't that simple myth of one fiery end.
Not at all. The history books and uncovered sources show us this much more complex picture. A gradual fading, a series of blows from different directions, political, economic, physical decay over centuries.
And the myths themselves tell their own story about how we remember and interpret the past.
Absolutely. The enduring power of those myths, even the debunked ones, says a lot about our need for clear narratives and symbols.
Well, hopefully, this journey has offered a new perspective on this legendary place, moving beyond the simple story to something richer, if maybe sadder, in its slow decline.
I hope so too. It's a reminder that history is often messier and more nuanced than the popular versions suggest.
Maybe a final thought for our listeners to ponder. What other historical events that seem clear-cut, with a single cause or moment, might actually have similarly complex, gradual, less dramatic stories hidden beneath the surface, waiting in the sources?
That's a great question. History is full of stories that deserve a closer look beyond the headlines. Keep digging into those sources.
Keep exploring those historical threads. Thank you for taking this historic road trip with us today on the History Stories podcast.